Hello and welcome to our food and movement project tutorial. For those of you who haven't made a coding project before, I'll share one of the first things I got told. It's good to make something that will be useful to yourself or others. And that got me thinking. I know so many people suffer with IBS, Crohn's and colitis, and all types of people learn to code, so I thought this would be a great project to help others and help those of you who want to make a project that may be useful to yourselves. Here is a preview of what we'll be making. On the left we got our food diary. You can add what you've eaten here. We can add, let's just say fatty if we want to add a trigger. This pizza was also spicy. Ouch. So I did one of these earlier as well. As you can see, a lot of pizza being eaten. And same for this, we can pick the day. We're in January, sorry. And look at that, it will show down here. So that's what we'll be making today. In this project, we'll cover what we use in HTML with a focus on the form, select and option elements. But we will go into more detail with the JavaScript, covering event listeners, DOM manipulation, data formatting, dynamic HTML updates, and clearing forms. There is minimal CSS in this project, but you can make it your own after completing this tutorial. Let's get started. I'm using VS Code here, and I've got a folder called Food Diary. We will need 3 files for this project: index.html, script.js, and style.css. Let's start with the HTML. I'm going to use a VS Code shortcut for the boilerplate. Type exclamation mark, and it's the first option. In the head element, we need to add our link element for our style sheet, and change the title to Food and Movement Tracker. In the body section, let's make our main title, so H1 with the class heading, and then we can just type the same as we did in the title. We need a div with the class container. We will keep everything for our page in this div for styling convenience. And then another div for the food diary section. We will give it the class section and the ID food diary. Next, our smaller heading, so we will use H2 type food diary. We will need a container to start doing our buttons and input, so we will use the form element and give it an ID of food form. To label this section on the browser, we will use the label element and use for attribute connects the label to an input with the matching ID. So let's add our input element with the ID of meal. And we need to identify the type. So for us, this will be text. A little extra we can add here is required. Just make sure the form isn't submitted without this. I'm adding a BR element for styling. This will put what follows on the next line. Next, we need to add our text. And then another label. We will use the for element attribute again, new trigger. And then add our input with the same ID. We can add a placeholder like so to give instructions or an example of what to add in this input. As people have different triggers, giving the option to add your own can be useful in the future for the people using this. We need a button to add this to the list of triggers. Type button and ID add trigger. We can type the same for the text and the button as well. Now to add our pre-selected triggers, feel free to add what you want here. Also, I'm adding line breakers after each one. To add our notes input, we will add a text taria element and an ID of notes. And let's say 4 rows. This is a good size for what we need it for. And we need a submit button. This is the end of our form element. Next, we will add a smaller heading to our entries. When we submit the above, it will be displayed in our entries section. I'll add a URL element to hold them in. We will do the added code for this input in JavaScript later. Next, onto our movement tracker. I'll go quickly in this section as it's a lot of the same elements. We need a div for our movement tracker, a H2 element as it isn't our main title, and let's start another form element with the ID movement tracker. Let's start with our date section. I'm using a label element with the for attribute set to date and the text date. We will first select day. Sorry for the Americans watching, this is a weird order for you. Then 1 to 31 like so. We will separate days, months and years with a /. If you want to store it, you can add it into a span element. Otherwise, this is fine. Next, the same again for months, 1 to 12. And then years. Repeat a similar process for our time section. Next, we can add a section for blood. Again, I will use a label, a for ID pair, and the add options. Let's add our submit button. And like we did for the food section, let's add an entry section to display the above once we have submitted it. Now we are at the bottom of our HTML, let's add our script tag to link our JS file. So let's have a look at our code so far. As you can see, everything we've added is here. We've got our 2 different sections. These all work. This won't work at the moment because we haven't done the JavaScript. Alright, let's continue. Let's add our styling quick. There is not much. In the body, I'm going to define the font family. I'm going to add a margin of 20 pixels. And white is a bit harsh, so honeydew is nice. The heading class, I want it to center in the page. And I'll also change the font family, maybe something different than the rest of the body. Class container, I'm going to use flexbox, so display flex, justify content, space between to align the items along the main axis. Align items flex start to position them at the top of the flex container, and gap 20 pixels for between our items. Our section class, flex1, so the item will expand and take up all available space in the container. Let's add some padding inside. Background color white so it stands out, and a border radius and a shadow to stop it looking so 2D. For ID movement tracker, align items to the left. Okay, let's have a look. Very nice. Onto the JavaScript. Right, we will start with the food diary logic first and work our way down the page. We first want to access the food form URL element on the HTML document. This will allow us to add the entries to the page. Document, get element by ID, and then the ID of the form element. Then we want our JavaScript code to execute when the submit button is pressed. So add event listener, submit, function E for event. Now let's write our function. First off, we want to prevent the default action of the form, which would reload the page or submit data to the server. Now we want to individually access the different sections on the food form. Const mil, document get element by ID, then mil.value. Value accesses the text typed into the mil input box. Const triggers, this one is different. We will use document query selector all to find all the input elements inside the trigger options with name trigger that are checked using the pseudo class check. And then using array from, convert this into an array, and then map will select the ones that are checked and get their values. And for notes, we will do the same as we did for mil. Okay, on to the second part of the food form function. Let's make a string including all of the above. We will use string interpolation. Basically, we will reference our variables in our string, like so. Triggers, we will join and use a comma for our argument to separate each item in the triggers array. This will also convert it into a string. We now need to access our entry's UL element to display this. So we just need the ID. And then we need to create a list element. We will now add the contents of entry to this. And then finally append child to add this to the UL element. This dot reset will reset all the fields in the form ready for the next submission. Inside our food form, we need to write some code for one more section, and that's the add customers trigger input we added earlier. We want this code to handle adding custom triggers. So for this function, we will access the button with ID add trigger and add a click event listener. Because we are not accessing default behavior, we do not need the event object E. We will declare a variable named new trigger value to access the value the user inputs. We will use trim to neaten it up by trimming any white spaces before or after the text. We will use an if statement to make sure the input is not empty, and the following code will only run if it meets this criteria. Let's make a label and then an input. First, we create a variable called new checkbox and create a label. Its inner HTML will be an input, so we can create one here, and also add its contents in one line as if we were doing it in a HTML document. We just need backticks instead of commas here, then input type, checkbox name trigger. Next, for the value and the text, we just enter our new trigger value, and then we are done. Next, we need to add this to the trigger options. And then we set the trigger input to an empty string, and it will be blank ready for the next trigger to be added. Else, if the criteria is not met in our if statement, we will send an alert to the user. Please enter a valid trigger, and this will pop up on the screen. Let's quickly have a look at our code and see how it works so far. We'll try this again. Make sure our trigger list works. Fantastic. Look at that. Alrighty, let's continue. Okay, so onto our next section of code, our movement tracker logic. This will start off similar to the food section. We will access the document again and get the form element with the ID movement form, and add an event listener for submit. We will need the event object so we can stop the default behavior again. We will use prevent default for this. Next, we need to access each section on the movement form. Let's start with day, then document get element by ID day. We will access its value, and then here's something new. We want to make sure the day is always 2 digits long, and if it isn't, it will start with 0. We can use pad start for this. The first parameter will be the desired length, and the second is what we want to fill out the length with, and the second is what we want to use as padding to reach the desired length. Let's repeat this for month. And then year doesn't need pad start. Hours will have pad start. And then the same again for minutes. Blood doesn't need it as its text, and the same for consistency as well. Next, we need to compress the individual time elements into one. So const time, and then we can just use string interpolation for hours and minutes. And we will use the same separator we use in the index file. We can do this for the date as well. Next, for our entry, we want to add these all together and separate them with commas. We want to access the movement entries URL element. Next, if you remember what we did for food, we created an list element. We will change the text content to our entries variable, and finally append it to our unordered list element. Now this is complete, we just need to reset the form, ready for the next submission. Let's check how it looks in the browser. Let's see how our code works. So this works all good. Oh, did that in the wrong section. But we got fires here. I guess fires can be a trigger. Yummy. Look at that. So there's a lot you can add to here. As you can see, everything works here. The page is very responsive. Our triggers work, the movement section works, the colors are right. Not too much going on. I hope you've learned something from this tutorial. It's been quite in depth, quite a lot going on, but all very useful things that you'll definitely use in the future. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please let me know in the comments below. Let me know anything that you've added to this. Drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye.